Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, it's 30th of April, 2023, and we're going to hear about Of Janet Frame and Angels by Janet Frame, discussed by Laila Namdarkhan. And do enjoy chatting to each other. This is a women-only webinar, so if you are male, please watch later on YouTube. So thank you so much, Laila, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Well, once again, I'm very pleased to be here to be able to present another one of the women writers who I have enjoyed reading again and again over the years. To many people, you may not know or have heard of Janet Frame, but she was quite a well-known writer back in the day, let's say from the 1980s. And you might all, or some of you might remember the movie Angel at My Table, which was a compilation of her autobiographical experience of mental ill health and being incarcerated in a mental asylum in the 1940s. But before I do that, I'd like to say a few words about New Zealand itself. Obviously, I'm not an aficionado on New Zealand. I just had a look at a few facts because I think that kind of locates Janet Frame from where she came. Currently, it's been in the news, as we know, with Kelly J. Keane and the violence that was witnessed in many parts of the world of her reception when she arrived in New Zealand to let women speak. I think many of us who watched that found it extremely distressing, where mob rule seemed to have taken over. And I was shocked, or I was surprised to know that New Zealand has the highest rate of intimate partner and sexual violence on the UN list of most violent countries for women, which is quite remarkable in a way, because New Zealand is just over 5 million people in population, and that's made up of sort of 53% people who call themselves Europeans, 28% Asian, 11.5% Maori, 15.5% Pacifica, and 2.3% for Middle Eastern and other nations. So it's a small population, but apparently it has the highest level of violence against women and children than anywhere else in the world, and it costs New Zealand about £7 billion a year, the distress and the level of calamity that it causes. There seems to be little research as to why this is the case, apart from the usual sort of things like drugs and alcohol. But interestingly enough, in any of the things that I've read, and I haven't done intensive research on this, so please feel free to do more, that pornography does not seem to have a place there, despite the fact that the incidence of violence against women in New Zealand has become increasingly sexual violence, with strangulation and other dangerous sexual practices being one of the increases of violence that women are experiencing. There is a theory that some of this is to do with what we call male hegemony, that New Zealand is a country that has developed into a male authority, male hierarchies, where white dominant males are the ones that are running the show, and within that context, there are men at various to be born there in 1924, when Janet Frame was born, is quite a thing to think about. The present context and the violence that we have seen is on display. It isn't just within the homes or within the context of what men absorb through pornography and other activities, but it's actually there in front of you when something happens that they totally disagree with, and it's not in context with what their beliefs are. So I'd like to start with the proposition, anyway, having said all that, that of Janet Frame and Angels, I want to ask the question, is female autobiography part of feminist consciousness raising? Is it radical? So just a little about Janet. As I said, she was born in New Zealand in 1924 to a working class family. With literary passions, her mother loved poetry and fancied herself to be a poet and wanted to be recognized as a poet, but within the family structure of a working class family, that was very difficult. But she was one of 4 girls and of 2 boys. 2 of her sisters would drown, which tragedy. To have 2 of your sisters drown, and one of the brothers was stillborn, and the other brother suffered from severe epilepsy. So her early years were shot through with various tragedies of one sort or another in a very poor environment. Her father was a railway worker, and her mother remained at home. They moved around quite a lot with their father's work in and around the I'm not quite sure how to pronounce Dunedin, which is apparently one of the largest cities in New Zealand, but they moved around a lot. And funny well, not funny, but at some point in the 1970s, Janet Frame changed her name to Neen Janet Patterson Clutha. One of her reasons for doing that was to protect her privacy after her autobiographies were published or were going to be published, but also in honor of Maori culture. She wrote, before she wrote the trilogy, she actually had written much poetry, which had been acclaimed, and also a great deal of fiction, as well as thoughts about the island on which she lived. So I'd like to start with the first book, which is not in the trilogy, which is Faces in the Water, which was published in 1980, is a work of fiction based on her own experience within the mid-20th century asylum system. I think for those of you listening or watching today, if you haven't worked within the mental health system, then you may have had your own kind of what I would consider to be imaginings of what it was like in enclosed asylums. I worked in an asylum for many years, and I worked in one of the most obscure asylums that still exists today. And so I have, along the way, had a great affinity with Janet Frame, and maybe I'll talk a bit more about my work later on to illustrate the level of isolation that is experienced by women in these circumstances. So Faces in the Water was published in 1980, and a fiction based upon her own experience of 20th century asylum system. This scene within the context of the talk frames first in-depth exploration of the vehicle of fictional character of dehumanization that as a woman she experienced within the enclosed wall of the asylum system. It's a shocking read, but it's also revealing how she has the ability to craft the mundane so that you actually feel as if you're there with the fictional character, Estina Mavitt. Estina is I think her maybe an alter ego of herself in that situation. as I said, it's a salutary read. And for any woman who has been incarcerated or worked in asylums settings, it's an all-consuming shredded truth to the bare bones. And the opening lines of chapter 7, which I'd like to read to you now. There's a lot of, when you look at movies about madness, it's often peculiarly romanticized. But here, in Faces in the Water, Frame says, there is an aspect of madness which is seldom mentioned in fiction because it would damage the romantic popular idea of the insane as a person whose speech appeals as immediately poetic. But it is seldom the easy Ophelian recited like the pages of a seed catalogue or the outpouring of Crazy James, who provide in fiction an outlet for poetic abandon. Few of the women who roamed the day room would have qualified as exceptional heroines. In popular taste, few were charming, the uninhibited eccentrics. The mass provoked most irritation, hostility, impatience. Their behavior affronted, caused uneasiness. They wept, they wailed, they quarreled, they moaned, they complained. They were a nuisance and were treated as such. It was forgotten, and this is really an important line for me. It was forgotten that they too possessed a prized humanity, which needed care and love, that the tiny poetic essence could be distilled from the overflowing, squalid truth. I think that's one of the major paragraphs in Faces in the Water that illustrate how her non-fiction spares no one in its barbarism of punishment led by psychiatric care, as if kicking women either with physical deprivation or the medical cost supports any form of cure and the return to a well, normal life without fear. So that kind of sets the scene in the fictional sense. I think that was the first of her books that I read, and then I was very hungry for more. There were a few books at the time when I was working that actually gave you the insight to women who were incarcerated. In fact, as a child, and I'm sure many of you share those memories, that my mother used to often say things like, if you kids don't stop this nonsense, I'll end up in Severals. And Severals was the mental hospital, not 10 miles down the road from us. And they were quite often used as places where mad women go when life got beyond what was expected of them. Moving to the trilogy, obviously it's a trilogy, 3 of them. The first is To the Island, which she wrote in 1982. Then it was Angel at My Table, and then Envoy to the Mirrored City. The last 3 are in all she wrote 20 books, plus collections of poetry. Her trilogy was the subject, as I said earlier in my introduction, the film Angel at My Table, for which I think Jane Campion got awards. This brought Frame into a wider audience and public arena. The 4 books noted here are the subject of some of what I want to continue talking about. To the Island, I often puzzle, well, what does that even mean, to the Island? But the answer is always found if you look in her work. At some stage or other, she will talk about it. She will drop it in. It won't be the first line of the book, but it will be dropped in. And in To the Island, she drops it in on page 13, where she says she is describing her family and so on. The thing about Frame was that she had a very furtive imagination, and she imagined all of her ancestors and wondered if they were with her in this colonial world that she lived with, because at that time New Zealand was still a British colony under the guise of the British. And so she tried to trace them back, and she would tell stories about them when she was a child to sort of embellish herself and her family as a way of sort of making them an interesting family. And so for her, there was the Wasland, and the Wasland is the one that she immersed herself in as a child of her ancestors and those who she feels formed her family background. And then moving on from that is the Island. And for her, the Island is where she was when these events that she writes about in her autobiographies, this is the Island where she is now. And from there, she says, the hopes and dreams of the future. So there's the past, there's the present, and then for her, there's the future. So the Island is the first book. So that's the beginning. Although it may not be readily accepted that Frame was amongst a canon of accepted feminist writers, as perhaps those of us today here know, the authentic crafting within her autobiography suggests that she used her wordsmith gift to break the taboo around women's experience of psychiatric incarceration. She eventually escapes the clutches of the oppressive asylum system. That Frame survived at all with her penship intact is nothing short of an act one might call of lifted out by angels. And I do believe that part of the second book is about that, is her lifting out and her seeing in her imagination that it was angels that helped her with that, and that these angels saved her from the leucotomy that had been prescribed as the last resort for her. After 200 sessions of electric shock treatment had apparently failed to jolt Frame out of her non-female conformity, supposed to make her normal. The hospital superintendent, upon hearing that Frame had won a literary prize, was the angel that arrived to gain her a reprieve. This began her long road to rehabilitation after spending 8 years in psychiatric sink wards. She was incarcerated in 1943 and out again in the early 1950s. The excruciating experience of a sink ward, if you haven't been in one, which I have, is not as the observed, but as an observer. Frame recalls how her intern friend Nola had not won prizes, so therefore she gained no reprieve. And I asked, so are angels really that selective? If they can remove one, why can't they remove them all? Or is it just the ability to write that acts as a symbolic saving grace for angels? In Frame's consciousness, here is Frame's own summation of the horror years from 1945 to 1953. So again, I'm going to read from Angels at My Table, which is again, gives you a great insight into her mind. I was discharged from hospital on probation after having received 200 applications of unmodified electro ECT, each the equivalent in degree of fear as an execution, and in the process having my memory shredded, and in some aspects weakened permanently or destroyed. And after having been subjected to proposal to have my serum changed by a physical operation into a more acceptable, amenable, normal woman, I arrived home at Willow Glen, outwardly smiling and calm, but inwardly with all confidence gone, with the conviction at last that I was officially a non-person. I had seen enough of schizophrenia to know that I had never suffered from it, and I had long discarded the prospect of inevitable mental doom. So from her experience, I don't know how many of you here have seen ECT. I have. It's the most shocking thing you will ever see in terms of alleged therapy. When I left my last post, there were two women who I worked with there as an advocate who regularly still received ECT treatment in the year 2000. When I left it in 2007, they were still performing ECT on women. And while ECT would relieve symptoms for a short period of time, the long-term prospects for these patients who would get this treatment was very, very poor indeed, because ECT would become addictive, and after a while the women would ask, can I have another session so I can think straight again? So it was a double-edged sword, a catch-22, and in the end, because the orchestrators of these wonderful tortures would have to say no, because the addiction would become very strong. All this. Yeah, I've lost my place. Bear with. Oh, it would not be until 1980s that Frame would write her own autobiographies to set the record straight, as she says. So how does her work justify being read as a radical feminist text? So I suppose I need to try and explain that. I suggest it does so because women writers historically have occupied little space in the construct of what it is to be female, and write about the experience in a way that allows the narrator to remain sane, and in doing so overcomes elements of the social sanction through autobiographical consciousness raising, to liberate that which has remained silent and, in Frame's case, absolutely too terrifying to articulate. Feminists have long believed that one way to navigate out of the phallocentric literary constraints is to free themselves through the written mode, the she, her, and consign the he, him to the rubbish bin. Writing for women has been a fundamental tool in the armory of holding on to one's sanity in cultures that historically defines what is and what is not acceptable in presentations of female and femaleness. Frame struggled for the most part of her life with a deep sense of isolation and loneliness, with massive inculcated ideas of the female as subhuman, with animalistic nature, unclean and imperfect. Born into poverty with three other sisters at varying times, she grew to understand that outgrown hand-me-down clothes incarcerated her body, that denied her growth and the need for comfort. There is kind of a theme throughout her trilogy and her own story about the importance of clothes. And I guess for those of us who haven't experienced the poverty of clothing, or who have been one sibling in a line of others who've worn the same dress, I know in families where girls wear the hand-me-downs and often wear the same dress throughout their secondary school life. So in the beginning, they get a large dress that is too big, and then by the time puberty hits in, the dress is too short and too tight and too, as she says, discomfort and feelings of incarceration. And much of what we see in the way of girls' fashion and women's fashion comes and go with that kind of incarcerated attire, which as feminists, radical feminists, we eschew. We feel comfort is more important than appearance, and we try to pass that on to younger women. Whether we are successful or not, I have no idea. Into the Islam, the first in the trilogy, frame sets the stage for the impending deep depression that will scold her life and leave scars that take decades to solve. The deaths of her sister and brother's epilepsy leave a vice that closes to render her speechless. The precision of her memory in recalling exact dates of her first period, I found, stays with me. It stays with me and reminds me of my own experience of having a first period. She describes very clearly that her first period came in August on her 15th birthday, and the visceral details of the clumsy way her mother deals with this by introducing her to torn up old hand towels to be pinned to her vest, and the ritual washing of the rags, the bulk, and the worst of all, the smell, haunt Frame's inner world as she pioneers herself through adolescence in the year of 1939, where war in Europe has just erupted that would eventually seep into the colonies like New Zealand. Frame describes this as a lightning that lit up New Zealand. Having survived the ravages of her early years and adolescence through poetry, writing, with imaginings of her ancestors and the natural world, Frame moves toward adulthood with inner terror but outer feminized pleasing and false consciousness. I guess we all know that place where inside we are screaming, raging, uncertain, unsure, scared of what's in front of us, but outwardly smiling and being the nice, kind girl who demands very little. And in fact, you have to read the books. I mean, seriously, in this hour, I can't really do the justice that she demands, or is what I would consider to be, what's the word I'm looking for? She ought to be better recognised. So, as we move to Angel at My Table, we find out that she moves on to 2 years in teacher training college and does 1 year training as a teacher. And throughout the book, we experience Frame's inner world of fear of the wider world, forced smiling through rotten teeth. I think that's one of the shocking things of the movie. Reading about it in the book and then actually seeing that was quite shocking, that her entire mouth was just a stack of rotten teeth, and she was absolutely petrified of going to the dentist. She had nightmares about it. She kept her hand over her mouth when she tried to smile through her lips, still trying to please people. And I mean, eventually all of the teeth were extracted at a very early age, and she had false teeth from then onwards. But these traumatizing events all stack up in what are considered to be for her very isolating and alienating circumstances. The pretending to be happy when it was all self-doubt and deep feelings of unworthiness, holding up a classic presentation, I would argue, of a young woman on the cusp of opportunity. Frame found herself not being able to be the woman the heteronormative world wanted her to be. All this would end with her being sectioned into a mental hospital for 8 years, labelled with a false diagnosis of schizophrenia. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about Women in Madness. and how it's perceived. The second wave feminism focused great attention on the political, social, and cultural context of women's lives from a Eurocentric lens, not only in forms of grassroots activism, but through redefining research that gave women a voice about the reality of their lives, of their lived experience of all forms of oppression through the written word. Feminists invested time and energy into studying and writing to break the taboo around women's bodies that had traditionally been the locus of women's oppression. We had freedom, the disease that had no name. We had Shallwater, the female malady. Both suggest that madness is predicated upon the gendered stereotypical relationships between men and women that confines women to the domestic sphere, while men freely occupy the public space in all its variety, and how such stultifying experience become trapped in what Marilyn Fry describes as a metaphorical bird cage in her 1983 essay, Oppression, in which she writes, "It is perfectly obvious that the bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be the least hindrance to its flight, but which by their relations to each other as confining at the solid walls of a dungeon." And that is how Frame's experience of 8 years, and she went in again further on in her life in when she was traveling. But that description by Fry is very, very much related to Janet Frame's experience of being incarcerated. The word asylum simply means a place of safety, and for many might have been, but for many women it was a place of horror and torture, as I've described previously. It is this false illusion of freedom that create the conditions of vacuous existence, one in which women are allegedly born to endure their lives with fixed sex-based, within fixed sex-based parameters, bring with them certain social energies that culminate in activation, symbolize and reinforce to the printed 85 in her seminal work, Women and Madness, described as imperial patriarchy, and actually believe that. When you work within the psychiatric system, especially in the high secure forensic psychiatric services, as I do, you realize that as a woman, whether you are an inpatient, whether you are a ward worker, whether you are a manager, whether you are, as it was in my situation, advocate running an advocate team, as a director of services, then you know that you are up against it when it comes to any discourse about feminism or the idea that we need to break free of the incarcerated model that was set up for men and try and applying that to women was an absolute disaster. And I believe that in some senses that still runs today, that that women are actually seen to be in need of secure detention rather than what my organisation was describing as relational security, which was that unless you build relationships with women in these situations, you cannot hope to be able to make the journey for them towards some sense of themselves as worthy human beings and wellness, because the overlay of labels comes generationally. You have schizophrenia, that then you have personality disorder, which has been applied to many women, that actually does not apply. Women are eminently treated in order to assist them to move out of those incarcerated environments. Second wave feminist accounts for women's mental health issues are often presented from the position of the observed. So like myself, and my experience of these situations is working alongside women and those looking after them. Whereas Frame does both. In her books, she does both. She is both the observed and the observed. So she observes every detail. Frame speaks both as the observed and the observer. As a female unknown writer and inpatient located in the 1940s asylum, light years away from second wave feminist disruption, her accounts of the vilification and the rigorous laws that govern incarcerated women's lives act as a reminder to all radical feminists that acting and behaving in ways that are not consistent with the ruling authorities of a given culture are silenced. If we turn to our experience within the history of second wave, we know only too well that declaring oneself a radical feminist is in many quarters an act of insanity, and in others a raw attempt at calling our demands for sex-based rights to be reduced to accusations that we hate men. Demands that are external to the accepted boundaries of what is acceptable from a woman. They're just not acceptable. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience. There are few places as a radical feminist that one can meet and talk to others who experience what I have experienced, plus also those who would even declare themselves feminists. Just to declare yourself feminist, as I said, is often an act of insanity, depending where you live and depending on the culture in which you find yourself. Non-conformity for women, be it our appearance, our ideas, or our challenges to practices that harm us as sex, are regularly accompanied with threats to harm or even kill. Although Frame's struggle does not mirror a generalized women's liberation movement, it does offer us a huge insight into a woman's experience of herself, attempting to make sense of a world in which prearranged offering is what disturbs her equilibrium, consequently being interpreted as madness. And it's true that what people wanted her to be, what people want women to be, disturbs our equilibrium as women and can lead us into all sorts of disliking ourselves and wanting to be accepted in a world that doesn't want to accept us for the way we are. As with Friedan's findings of talking to women who seemingly have it all, the thread that is missing from interrogating the preordained role for women has to be, what does it mean to be free as a woman? Since that question is always absent. It's always absent, isn't it? I would ask the staff, what does it mean to be free? And they would look very vague about what is freedom. What does freedom mean? It brings to mind the song, me and Bobby McGee, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing is nothing, but it's free. And to remove people's freedom simply on the basis that they don't fit in, or they're not allowed to be who they want to be in that sense, is frightening. As Frame asks, where would I have lived my life had not literature been given to me by my mother and school? It's very interesting that she was very well read, Frame. I think she was a voracious reader, and her mother encouraged that within the family, despite the horrendous levels of poverty. And she had good teachers at school where she went to school. And these were also angels that saved her, the saving grace and able to rebuild her sanity. As her discontent from daily life grows wider, her dungeon walls closer in further and further. I look for other examples just to widen the reach of this presentation. And obviously, I can't really do this without mentioning Kate Millett. Kate Millett, who wrote Sexual Politics, which I think, if my memory serves me well, not as good as phrase, I think was one of the first radical feminist books that I read that almost made my eyes fall out with enlightenment. The crack arrived and the light came in. And that was her book written in 1989 called The Looney Bin Trip. I don't know how many of you read that book. What has been described, the book has been described as a savage account of Millett's incarceration into an Irish mental asylum in the mid-1980s. Some might have thought that the situation for women deemed mad would have improved over that interim 50 years since Frame's account. But as Showalter explains, psychiatry simply moved from the 19th century misogynist diagnosis of hysteria, often culminating in actual removal of the uterus, the believed locus of our women's resistance to the birdcage life, to the 20th century zeitgeist of psychiatry, which was schizophrenia. Having looked again at feminist thought on the issues I'm talking about today, I came across varying commentaries that, to be honest, I couldn't really make a lot of sense of. And I think that just it irritates me beyond words when people want to talk postmodernism and they want to talk queer politics and they want to erase women who in all circumstances given the opportunity to talk, and yet there are aspects and programs afoot that want to erase our very being, and with it our experience as women, as sex-based human beings, as female, as women. And that's very worrying. There are many women, there are feminist campaigns at the moment about Yas Wood, where women are incarcerated who have committed no crime. And there's also Nauru in Australia, where various films have been made about the incarceration of people there who are asylum seekers who've never even reached Australia, but are taken to Nauru and are incarcerated there for indefinitely. I mean, indefinitely. They are, the women and men that are there are incarcerated to act as a bulwark to prevent other people trying to enter Australia as asylum seekers. And the documentary that I have seen is nothing short of pushing people down the rabbit hole of complete madness. And it's totally obscene that you would do that as a punishment to people who have committed no crime, or even to people who have committed a crime. To be frank with you, the prison system in this country, which I also have experience of from Holloway Prison and other female prisons, strangely enough treats women much better than our mental institutions do. It is quite shocking. So I came across varying commentaries that I personally don't subscribe to having spent long years working alongside women incarcerated in some of the UK's most notorious forensic psychiatric establishments, that of and the view I'm talking about is the Butlerist ideology that asserts bodily viability, i.e. bodies of women not sexed, are the obstacles to liberating us from the straitjacket of misogynist psychiatric diagnosis. And the bodies of women are seen and always have been historically as problematic, since compared to men who act as the default for humanity. I read Butler and am astonished how working for the erasure of her own sex leaves women in a state of limbo, where we will apparently be free from the vagaries about illogical sex to acquire a gendered existence, which apparently will be free of all this hostility and terror. And I think there is not one shred of evidence that supports that kind of view. My work in Broadmoor brought me into very close contact with a whole variety of women of varying ages. Some were newly incarcerated, some had been there for longer than they could even remember for alleged crimes that are no longer crimes. And to say that those women would have been happier in a gendered existence rather than the women they were, what had happened and what has happened is that sex-based rights are taken away. That's what happens. That's the basic truth. And these are the truths that come through in Janet Crane's autobiographies, that when your rights are taken away, you can imagine in 1940s, we had the Human Rights Act. Women, I think New Zealand was one of the first countries, where women were able to vote. But as I said in the beginning, there's this macho hierarchy, mostly dominated by white, the original, not the originals obviously, but the offspring of the settlers in New Zealand when it was became a colony and dominated by white values and white male phallocentric governance. And although I think New Zealanders had a female prime minister, I don't think that had very little impact on the actual culture of the way in which women are viewed there. So and certainly what comes out of Frane's book is that whole idea of disconnect, living on an island, that you're disconnected from a wider world. You are disconnected from your culture in the sense that you are not Maori, so therefore you're not indigenous, and you're part of the colonizing elite, even if you're the poorest of that elite. And I think these things trouble Frane's consciousness. And then there's the disconnect between herself and the world, where she suffered enormously. And I have met that disconnect amongst women within the mental health system. I want to just explain one thing. Before I worked in the forensic high secure, I worked in mental health at a lower level, if you like, and we had wards that were called secure wards, and they were women only at the time. And I was working as a staff nurse on one of these wards, and just in there actually. I'd worked in general services before that, and this was my first encounter. And these were women that were detained under the Mental Health Act. So actually they had rights, they did have rights. And those rights were that they were to be treated with respect, dignity and humanity. And they were to be receiving treatment that was working towards their rehabilitation and return to society. And I arrived on the ward one shift, and there were two women sitting on a sofa, and they had their arms around each other. And let me tell you, there's very little comfort in these incarcerated places. And when many women obviously found comfort in each other, comfort and friendship, and so on. And as I entered the ward, another staff equivalent to me rushed out of the office and screamed and shouted at these two women that she was going to make sure that if they didn't stop this canoodling and hugging each other, then they were going to be transferred to Holloway Prison. I was astonished at how cruel and unnecessary all of that interruption was. The women stood up to attention as if they were some sort of war criminals, and destroyed their peace of mind, destroyed again their equilibrium. And it's very tough watching that. So anyway, I did have it out with her in the office and said that I was going to report her to the senior management if I ever saw her do such a thing again, and that she was totally out of her tree to do that. And again, standing up for the oppressed is not always a good thing, in the sense that, yes, you say what you have to say, but you are made to suffer. I was asked after a while that I needn't bother to try for promotion in this area because I was too much of a risk. There were lots of incidents like that, and in fact, I did report several people to the mental health tribunal. So anyway, getting back to this one, I find the railroading of women as subject will mean little to those of us incarcerated by silence. Will we, like Frame and Miller, only be able to relate our inner world through a textual consciousness raising? I'm thinking about the future and the current situation that we're in. Will we, after the things that we've seen going on over the past, 10 years, will we be able to write books about it 40 years later if we're still here? Will we be able to relate all this in a way that makes sense to that generation? I don't know. So would that be autobiography that meets a feminist criteria that talks about the very day, the everyday in challenging and transgressive terms that enable us to gain the power over our lives? Frame's trilogy works after long travels and further self-admissions to Maudsley in the well-known mental hospital in the UK. She learns that her diagnosis of schizophrenia is false and that she is suffering from mistreatment rather than illness. I mean, can you imagine that? An actual psychiatrist told her that you are not mentally ill, you are mistreated. Who do you sue? Who do you go after for that? Who takes responsibility for the crushing of the human mind with 200 sessions of ECT and then a threatened dichotomy, lobotomy? There isn't, is there? And I would imagine it's the same today. In the third book, in the final book, Envoy to the Mirror City, Frame travels, writes, meets many characters from the literary and art world of London, never loses sight, though, of the mirrored city, the shining light of her unique imagination, her own mind's eye, where her metaphorical envoy pulls her towards her determination to live and work as a writer. She travels to Europe, she travels to America, she lives with various people who open their doors to her. who value her work, who praise her work. She's received enormous amount of prizes from all over. She's, you know, received all kinds of accolades, and yet so few people know of her. And I hope that today that helps to set people's minds in motion and maybe read the books. So my final thoughts as we approach the end of this talk is the question, is Frame a radical feminist? I would argue perhaps not, in the sense of claiming such a position for herself, but definitely in terms of Faces in the Water and the autobiographical trilogy, where it's clear Frame did not take the advice of the nurse on leaving the asylum, which was, when you leave hospital, you must forget all about what you have seen here. Just put it out of your mind completely, as if it never happened, and go and live a normal life in the outside world. So after 200 sessions of ECT and being placed on a ward where the toilets had no doors, where there was no privacy, where food was sparse, where rules were rigid, you're supposed to forget all about it. It sounds like forms of violence against women, the trajectory of that, you know, that you experience all of this violence, but actually you need to forget all about that. You know, nobody's interested in hearing all about that. So just go get on with your life. And that's what many women are told. Thousands of women are told every day. Look, I mean, you didn't really mean it, you know, just get on with it, you know, sake of the kids and all this business. Don't worry about it. Men abusing women, that's fine, you know, just suck it up, you know, they don't mean it, it's just banter. So this was what she was told, but 40 years on, Frame put into text a stream of authentic consciousness from the depths of her soul. The all too familiar hurts that women experience from girlhood are to be locked away into womanhood and remain in silence. Second wave unblocked those silences for many women, though still today remain unpalatable truths about women's lives and what might have been gained that afforded us a taste of freedom from the birdcage, as we see, can easily be eroded and ultimately lost. Just releasing our own stories in our own words is a radical act. Thank you, everybody.